Hi, welcome to our class online. So we have a couple of different things we'll cover this week. First, we have a few things to wrap up on the last topic we were discussing, which is exchange in different types of societies. Remember, for the readings for each of the topics, you can reference the syllabus to see which readings relate to each topic. The next topic we'll cover this week is kinship and marriage. We touched on that before face-to-face classes ended. And so I have sort of a brief lecture about both of kinship and marriage for you that I'll post later this week. And then finally, I also have an introduction to identity, the next topic we'll be discussing in this class that I will also post for you this week. We'll be talking about identity, including ethnicity, race, gender, and nationalism. So we'll be starting with ethnicity on Thursday. So just to pick up and wrap up, all I have for you with this lecture is a wrap up on exchange. And namely, the last type of exchange that we left off talking about was market exchange. And so remember, market exchange is the most recent type of exchange from the perspective of human existence. Reciprocity, redistribution, and market exchange are our three forms of exchange. Reciprocity and redistribution have been around for the majority of human existence. And so the rise in market-dominated societies has coincided with a rise in something we call consumer culture. And again, we sort of touched on this before we left, just to recap it leading up to a video we're going to watch. And so one reason for increasing consumption rates in the US and other countries around the world is related to this rise in market economies. Increased consumption, consuming more and more, expanding wants and needs. This isn't necessarily a natural human condition. It's a recent condition and it's cultural rather than natural. And so other types of exchange, reciprocity and redistribution that have characterized most of our existence, these are about the objects, the stuff being exchanged, but also the subjects, the people involved in the exchange. So with reciprocity, individuals and groups pass objects back and forth. Remember, balanced, generalized, and negative are our three types. And people practice reciprocities for all sorts of reasons. To share food, to help people in need, to create social relationships, to instigate, maintain, and reinforce them as well. We also practice reciprocity. We do it with our parents, friends, coworkers, partners. We talked about it in class. And so with reciprocity, it's about the stuff, but also the subjects, the people involved. And in the case of redistribution, goods are sort of collected and then reallocated back out among the group, usually to serve some sort of common good, either by supplying goods like infrastructure for the group as a whole, or tax money, maybe that goes to vulnerable populations. Either way, with redistribution, it's about the stuff, but also the people, the objects, and the subjects. In market exchange, people are largely left out of the equation, if you will. So what I mean is, in market exchange, it becomes mostly about the objects, not the subjects, not the people involved. And so in market economies, exchange has little to do with social relationships or anything really beyond the object and the value, the price you can get for it in the market. And this has implications for our social relationships. People sort of become impersonable variables along the way. The focus is on the market price, the profit. These are the main incentives shaping market exchange, while people, the subjects, as an incentive in market exchange, are left out largely, left out of the equation. So remember, I touched on market exchange being somewhat similar to negative reciprocity. Remember, in negative reciprocity, someone in the exchange is harmed, one party, either the receiver or the giver, because someone's getting a short sort of end of the deal. They're not getting as much as they're giving. There's a cost, there's a harm done. And so in market exchange, there's also a cost, a harm done. but the cost doesn't fall on either party directly involved in the exchange. It doesn't fall on the producer making the goods and selling it for a profit, and the costs don't fall on the consumer who buys their stuff at a pretty cheap price. In market exchange, the costs, the harm, is externalized. It's deferred onto other people and other places. Again, the producer, the person making the stuff or selling it, they're making money. The consumer's getting a good deal on the product, the price tag, and the costs that allow us to make all this cheap stuff and buy it cheaply, those fall again on other people in other places in the world. Our cheap products are possible because a lot of companies don't pay fair wages. They pay low exploitative wages to populations in other places around the world working in factories. They don't have labor laws or safety laws, things like minimum wage or mandatory health care. So there's these social externalities that aren't paid for in the price of production, and also environmental externalities. The pollution, the CO2, the other toxins emitted from making all this cheap stuff. And typically, that's also exported out to other places and other environments. That's one reason that a lot of businesses in the US historically and still today will go overseas to do business. They'll move their factories or whatever it is overseas so that they can pay their workers less because there's no regulations preventing it, and so they can pollute and not have to pay for their pollution because there's no regulations preventing it. That's actually, on a side note, that's one argument for regulation in the US of businesses, is to prevent some of these excesses and abuses, these social and environmental costs, right? So require people, regulate them, require them to pay fair wages, to clean up or pay for their pollution. And so there's sort of two sides to the argument on that. Some people say we should deregulate, it's better for business. The argument for regulation is that we need some rules to prevent some of these social and environmental abuses. So it's sort of an interesting thing. We often realize the benefits of market exchange. We get to enjoy a lot of the cool, cheap stuff. We can sell our labor on the market if we don't like our employer, i.e. our boss. We can work for different wages. We have options. So we see the benefits. We don't always realize some of the costs. And so that's sort of where we're headed with the lecture today. On a related note, increased consumption, us using more resources, consuming more stuff, creating more pollution, the byproduct of all that consumption. This is driven by this rise in consumer culture. And so it's also believed to be one of the main driving forces behind our environmental problems, consumption. And until recently, a lot of concerns about sustainability and environmental health focused primarily on population rather than consumption. And so the idea goes back to a famous demographer, Thomas Malthus, that wrote over 200 years ago this essay on population. And he said that humanity, people, reproduce exponentially, right? One person has 2 kids, each of those children have 2 more kids, etc. So population grows exponentially, but food resources only grow finitely. You plant one field, you plant another field, you plant a third field to grow your crops. And eventually the number of people will outstrip the food supply. That's what Malthus said. And so he wrote this over 200 years ago, and this type of thinking is still around today. It drives contemporary environmental policy. For example, a few decades ago, and maybe still happening today, because of framing the problem in terms of having a population problem, too many people and not enough room on Earth because we will run out of resources. There's not enough space in the world to sort of there's not enough capacity to absorb our pollution. There's not enough resources for us. And so because of that, we've come up in the US and other places with solutions to the population problem to solve environmental issues. For example, a few years ago in India, US aid dollars, meaning your tax money, was paying for sterilization procedures being done on poor people in India to deal with the population problem. And so, two things. First of all, the population problem is a scapegoat. Yeah, we do have people. We wouldn't be talking about human impact on the environment if people weren't part of the equation. Um, but keep in mind that a very small proportion of the world's population consumes the bulk of its resources and produces the most of the pollution. For example, the US, 5% of the population produces over a third of the pollution and consumes over a third of the world's resources. And so researchers now are suggesting that consumption rates are just as, if not more important than population growth rates. Again, uh, the Malthusian thinking still lingers and still informs policy today. It keeps the focus off consumption, which is probably the bigger part of the problem. Also, probably part of the problem that people in the Western world don't feel like dealing with. And so trends show now that consumption is just as important as overall population. What you're seeing in the graph is population growth rates, global, and also world food consumption rates. And so that bottom thickest line, that's population growth from 1965 to 1995. And you'll note the global population is now past its period of most rapid growth. Most demographers predict global population based off current fertility rates, which are changing worldwide, will stabilize sometime near the middle of this century, around 9 billion. Um, and so consumption seems to be as much, if not more, of a problem. If you look from top to bottom, food consumption rates from, let's see, world fish and seafood consumption is the top line. Below that, world meat consumption, and below that, world milk consumption. So you can see food consumption rates are all outpacing population growth. And note that the meat and the animal products, the dairy, that's even more consumptive because you have to feed those animals grain and water to then eventually eat the products, including the milk or the meat. And when you do that, 90% of the energy that's consumed is lost at each level. So only about 10% of that plant matter that you fed to that animal is actually converted into usable products for humans. The point being that meat, animal products is way more consumptive than, say, just plant-based products. Another graph, same idea here, showing resource use rates outstripping population growth rates. This is in terms of forestry products from the Food and Agricultural Organization. So again, 1965 to 1995, that thickest black line near the bottom is world population growth, and all the other lines, you can reference the graph, but different forestry products. And you can see in almost every case, resource use is outstripping population growth. And so increased consumption is related, as we've been discussing, to the rise of consumer culture. Um, Again, we discussed this, but to recap, what is consumer culture? It's when the purchase, ownership, and use of commodities, of stuff, objects, and what they signify, what they symbolize, become the center of social life. So it's a picture, really ostentatious big bag. I obviously shop somewhere really expensive. Bet you wish you could afford this stuff. The idea is the stuff that we buy, that we wear, that we use. Um, we don't buy it just for the use value. Uh, it also carries a symbolic value that's determined by our culture. And in consumer culture, needs, wants, desires, these become merged, right? You need water, you need food, but do you need an iPhone? Do you need a new phone? Do you need more clothes, more songs on your phone, etc.? And these become conflated. Uh, Marketing and advertising, billions of dollars also go into that to keep us sort of wondering what we need versus want versus what might make us happier if we could just have the right stuff. And in consumer culture, the tangible object of consumption, the actual thing that you're buying, the commodity, that becomes less important than its culturally coded meaning. And so I asked you in one of our last classes, what I meant by this. The object is less important than the meaning it carries. And so what I mean is a purse or a bag is not necessarily valued because of its use as an object. You use it to carry your stuff. An old sewed up rag, a plastic Vaughn's grocery bag could do the same thing, could serve the same purpose. The purse also has a symbolic meaning, right? Coach or Gucci or not like I can afford any of that stuff, but whatever people's thing is. It's not just about the bag. It's not just about the use of the object. It's about the symbolic meaning the object carries. And again, the symbolic meaning is determined by culture. Um, there's a reason why most of us wear at least semi-professional clothes when we show up to work. I'm realizing that can be a blurred line, but most of us don't show up in sort of gym shorts or a muumuu, which is a house dress. And what would you think if you walked into class and that's what I was wearing, right? Because again, it's not so much about the stuff, the use value, any sort of clothes cover us. It's about that symbolic value too. And so, although many different material products are valued for their practical use, like food nourishes us, housing shelters us, clothes cover us, a great many material products are also valued symbolically. And again, that symbolic value is determined by culture. So food choices can express identity. No pork, for example, in Judaism, or no beef, veganism, or excuse me, vegetarianism in Hinduism. Houses can demonstrate wealth, right? How many bathrooms does the house have? Motor vehicles can demonstrate wealth and status. Clothes flatter us, and like most other consumables, send social messages about who we are. And then a lot of objects are bought and sold entirely for their symbolic significance. Think about jewelry, cosmetics, haircuts. And so, in other words, we buy stuff. We dress certain ways, we drive certain cars, we have the latest phone because it signals to others who we are, what we're about, what our identity is. And consumerism doesn't just define who we are, it also defines our economy. A huge percentage of the US workforce is involved in the production of consumer goods and services. Consumption is the engine of economic growth in the capitalist system. And actually, you can see that going on right now with the current coronavirus situation. Due to the public health crisis, we have shelter in place orders and essentially have shut down most of the US economy. People can't work. If people can't work, if they can't spend money, if they can't pay their workers, the system shuts down. And so typically, coronavirus aside, the system's designed, for example, through marketing, through advertising, to encourage us to keep consuming. When you hear politicians talking about tax cuts, that's why. It's to stimulate the economy, to give people more money or business owners more money to spend it, right? Or to pay their workers. Excuse me. And so, to wrap up our topic on exchange, we're going to watch a short film clip called The Story of Stuff. And to watch the clip, not Blackboard, uh, PowerPoint won't let me play a YouTube film from the presentation I'm recording for you. And so what you're going to do is either copy and paste or type that address, that URL that I provided for the story of stuff into your browser, and it should pop right up. It's about 21 minutes long, and then go ahead and watch it. And so just a little background before I leave you, why we're watching it. It's about consumption, and specifically this increasing consumption in relation to the impact it's having on people and the environment. Not so much just in the US, but globally. And don't worry too much about the environmental stuff. It's very interesting and important, but that's not exactly why we're watching it. We're watching it because it's a great explanation of the global market economy. Again, we often feel the benefits, tons of cool, cheap stuff, but we don't always learn about some of the drawbacks, these social and environmental costs and externalities I mentioned earlier. And so a couple of questions to keep in mind as you watch the film, and maybe jot down some notes. What are externalities? These externalized costs I've been discussing, whether social or environmental, through not paying people fair wages or providing insurance or safe working conditions, not accounting for pollution or being allowed to dump your toxic byproducts into our freshwater systems. These are the externalized costs that are not included in the production, the cost of production. So they're going to talk about it. What are externalities? And then also, what is perceived obsolescence and planned obsolescence? These are two key strategies in the market economy to keep us consuming. And so sort of since we're going to end the lecture and then you'll watch the clip, a few things that I would sort of add, just food for thought after you watch the clip or while you're watching it. Many social scientists would argue that what you can do, one thing you can do to change the system is start pricing in these externalities. Start including the true cost of our production, paying fair wages, not polluting. Include that in the costs that people have to pay for the stuff they're making. And then that will be passed on to the consumer. Businesses will pass that increased cost on to the consumer. The consumer can then pay that increased cost, which will help pay for and alleviate the social and environmental costs associated with production. So they can either pay that increased cost to offset these externalities, or the consumer might make different choices because they don't want to pay that much for this polluting product. And other companies can then come in and compete to fill that void. The idea is sort of change the incentives, price in those costs into the cost of production, into the price the consumer pays, and people will start to make different choices. We won't be so wasteful. So with that said, go ahead and after I end the lecture, you can go ahead and watch Story of Stuff, and then that is all I have for you to wrap up our topic on exchange in different types of societies. The next couple topics that we'll be touching on this before the week's over is a lecture on kinship and marriage. We don't have as much time as I'd like because of the COVID situation and the pause week. And so I'm going to sort of keep it simple, give you the important nuts and bolts that you need to know for kinship, and then we'll dive into marriage, which gets really, really interesting. And then we'll start a new topic that we'll be discussing next week as well, which is identity, including gender, race, ethnicity, and nationalism. And we will kick that off with a discussion, a very brief intro to ethnicity. And then you're going to watch a film called Becoming American. It's about the Hmong refugees that were relocated to the U.S. after the U.S. CIA's secret war in Southeast Asia. So more to come on that later in the week. Watch Story of Stuff, and I hope you guys are all taking care, staying safe, and hopefully this wasn't too painful to listen to. Congratulations, we made it through our first online lecture.